Is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our guests are Kavita Krishnan, Secretary of the All India Progressive Women's Association, one of the lead organizers of the protests in the aftermath of the rape and death of a young woman student on a moving bus in Delhi. We're also joined by Elora Chowdhury, an Associate Professor of Women's Studies at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. Juan?
Well, I'd like to bring Elora Chowdhury into the conversation. Your reaction not only to what the massive protests in India, but also to the way the media in the West has been covering events there, and the somewhat level of hypocrisy in terms of the fascination with the specifics of the terrible attack that occurred.
Yes, I have been following the media reports both in South Asia and in the U.S. and U.K. in the so-called Western world about on coverage on this event. And I think what I would suggest here is that we bring a dual critique to these events. So on the one hand, we see in the Western media some reporters taking this moral high ground and pointing fingers and demonizing Indian culture as though sexual violence against women is pervasive in only certain parts of the world, and that it's somehow reflective of deeply inherent cultural traditions of that part of the world. Of course, what that obscures is that both rape and domestic violence are pervasive in the United States, and domestic violence being one of the leading causes of injury to women, and exceedingly high numbers of rapes that, in fact, mostly go unreported in the United States. So I think embedded in these kinds of reporting is a certain colonial mindset, of course, that there's a long history of that. And these kinds of mindset that women are the measure of the progress of a society emerges from colonial practices, that these ideas were used to legitimize both colonization and also imperialism. So that is something that we have to keep in mind in reading these reports. At the same time, however, I think that while the massive protests that have occurred in India around this particular case are very significant, and one can hope that it will lead to also significant changes in women's position. However, I think we also have to think about the particularities of this case and how embedded in these kinds of the reporting in this case are also certain class-based assumptions about the poor. So one of the things that I have found striking is that how so many of the reports are referring to the slum colony where I think at least 4 of the perpetrators live as some kind of a breeding ground for criminals. Also referring to poor men as illiterate and as violent, somehow normalizes these kinds of violent attacks and associates them with poverty, and it ends up criminalizing the poor, whereas rape and sexual violence, of course, is pervasive, it's systematic, it's routine, and we have to also think about the ways in which rape attacks and violence against women reported in middle-class communities, in certain elite communities, are not exposed or talked about, or do not elicit quite as much of a moral outrage. So I think the assumptions, the class-based assumptions here in this reporting are also something that are quite striking.
I mean, looking at figures in the United States, I think it's something like, according to one organization, every 2 minutes, a woman is sexually assaulted. Another figure is that in the United States here, 1 in 4 college students, college women have been either raped or attempted rape, sexually assaulted. And then I want to go to the broader issue. As protesters take to the streets in India, women's rights activists here at home are lamenting the news that House Republican leaders have stalled the 2012 reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, an embattled bill that would have extended domestic violence protections to 30 million LGBT individuals, undocumented immigrants, Native American women. Given the delay renewing gender equality bills at the federal level, some activists are ramping up their calls for the U.S. to once and for all ratify the UN Bill of Rights for Women. Only 8 countries have failed to ratify the convention, leaving the U.S. in the company of Iran, Somalia, and Sudan. And the public protests against sexual violence in India are leading some to question the United States' own track record, where only 24% of alleged rapes even result in arrest, never mind a conviction. I am wondering, Kavita Krishnan, your thoughts on this issue as a leading women's rights activist in Delhi who is leading the protests in the aftermath of this particular brutal rape and death.
I completely agree with I just wanted to say briefly that I agree with what Elora said, and the person who's led the charge in trying to demonize the migrant workers has been India's Prime Minister, who has referred to them as a menace and called them footloose migrants and said that they are the main threat of sexual violence, which is completely misplaced, as she said. You have, across the board, you have a huge number of cases of custodial rape. Some of the most important cases which have galvanized the women's movement in India before this incident have been the custodial rapes of indigenous woman called Mathura around 35 years ago, and the custodial rape by army of a woman in northeast India who was suspected of being a militant, arrested, raped and killed in 2004. So it's important to contextualize that. But what you said about the U.S., I think that's very true. We should keep in mind, the kind of victim blaming I described, obviously that is not happening only in India. Those biases are not only in India. You had the slut walk protests all over the world. So obviously this is a larger phenomenon. But I wanted to briefly tell you that we are also seeking changes in the laws, because the laws in India are, again, many of them are a colonial legacy, and we are continuing with investigative practices and laws which are a colonial legacy and are extremely biased towards women. For instance, a woman who goes through rape, who's a rape survivor, she is subjected to a medical test called the 2-finger test, in which the doctor puts 2 fingers in her body to make sure, to find out if she is habituated to sex. There have been court judgments in India against this practice, but it continues, and the government is yet to put an end to this practice. Then you have laws which refer to molestation as outraging of modesty, sexual harassment as eve-teasing. So these are usages and laws that trivialize the experience of sexual violence, and our laws have a very narrow definition of sexual violence. They do not cover a whole range of types and varieties of sexual violence, including stalking, throwing of acid to disfigure the face, and stripping and sexual humiliation, and so on. So we are seeking changes in the law that actually recognize Indian women's experience of sexual violence.
I'd like to ask Elora Chowdhury also about the larger issue, obviously, as India has been rapidly industrializing in recent decades, and millions of people have been coming from the countryside into the cities, and women, of course, have been joining the industrial workforce and the city workforce in huge numbers. The larger social pressures and the impact on the male supremacy and on an oppression of women, that this movement is really sort of the tip of the iceberg of what's going on there.
Yes, absolutely. I think I completely agree with Kavita here, that I was struck from the reports that I think almost all 6 of the men who have been charged with rape in this case are economic migrants to Delhi. And this is, of course, reflective of a larger trend. Reports also suggest that if you combine the numbers of rapes that were reported in major cities in India in the last year, Delhi exceeds the combined number of rapes in other cities. Delhi is being called the rape capital of the region. I think we also need to look at the changes happening as a result of various social and economic and cultural forces that are underway, increasing globalization, movements of people, conspicuous consumption, the representation of all this in the media that is so easily available. All of these, I think, and just the changes happening in urban spaces as a result of all of these different kinds of forces and gender dynamics jostling with one another create different kinds of changes in gender dynamics. We have to think about the particularities of this case from what I have read, that the young woman was being punished for speaking out, for being out late for being out so late at night with a male companion, that she dared to defy male authority on the bus, that all of these contributed to this horrific event. And we really need to look at sexual violence against women not only as an issue of men versus women, but also these other changes that are occurring in our societies and how those contribute to challenging male supremacy and the sense of entitlement.
Kavita Krishnan, we just have 30 seconds. What are the plans now for the mass movement dealing with this rape and death? Today, the 5 men formally charged in an Indian court with gang rape and murder of the woman who is yet to be publicly identified.
Well, we are struggling now to keep the concerns of women's rights and women's aspirations for freedom center stage, because there's an attempt on part of the government to shift the entire debate onto certain forms of punishment or onto whether to name a law after this rape victim or not. So we are trying to keep the concerns about women's rights and their aspirations for freedom center stage. The women in this movement have been, I just want to mention that briefly, that they have been raising slogans saying, "My voice is higher than my skirts and don't tell me how to dress." And we think that that is something which is an important assertion, and it's something, it's a very important takeaway from the struggle, and we will build around that.
Well, we will continue certainly to cover it. Kavita Krishnan, Secretary of the All India Progressive Women's Association, one of the main protest organizers, speaking to us from New Delhi, and Elora Chowdhury, Associate Professor of Women's Studies at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, speaking to us from Boston. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, New York Times has another expose on the Bangladeshi factory making clothes for Walmart, where there was a major fire, at least 111 deaths, many of them rural women who had come into the capital of Bangladesh for work. Stay with us. Thanks so much for watching this report from Democracy Now!, your daily independent global news hour. We don't accept advertising or corporate funding, but rather rely on donations from viewers like you. Please make your contribution by visiting democracynow.org. We need your support today to keep bringing you this hard-hitting, in-depth reporting.